Though Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest are clearly the flagship franchises for Square Enix, the long shadow cast by Chrono Trigger has also left an undeniable mark on the world of gaming and the role-playing genre. There was one attempt at a follow-up, arriving in the form of a visually stunning and ambitious game called Chrono Cross, but it didn't have quite the same cultural impact as its predecessor, and after its release, the IP was put on hold by the powers that be at Square, as it simply did not achieve the prerequisite that was in place at the time, which required all games to sell 1 million physical copies in Japan if there was to be any chance of a follow-up. In spite of this, it's long been felt that, given the quality of the two released entries in the Chrono series and the clear appetite for more, that Square Enix would see the logic in producing another game. And for a period of time at least, it seemed that the senior team at Square Enix agreed with this assertion. But unfortunately for fans, despite a whole lot of talk about a potential third game called Chrono Break, no continuation has ever materialized. So what really happened to the next entry in the Chrono series? We invite you to find out as we explore the curious case of Chrono Break. The origins of the Chrono series go all the way back to the early 1990s, when the home console role-playing genre was dominated by just two series, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. The former was overseen by Yuji Horii, and it had taken the Japanese video games industry by storm when it launched on the 27th of May 1986, through a combination of addictive, turn-based role-playing gameplay, inspired by genre progenitors Ultima and Wizardry, character and enemy designs by Akira Toriyama, the famed manga artist responsible for Dragon Ball, and music by Koichi Sugiyama. The latter franchise was overseen by a combination of Hironobu Sakaguchi, Koichi Ishii, and Akitoshi Kawazu, who were also collectively influenced by Ultima and Wizardry. Many other rivals did crop up, but these two franchises remained at the top of the tree, and after the release of Final Fantasy III, a friendly rivalry began to form. Both teams were keen to play their opponents' games, as they were not only fans of the genre, but were also keen to know what their contemporaries were up to, as neither ever wanted to be accused of copying the other. It therefore did not take long for the paths of Horii and Sakaguchi to cross, and sometime around 1991, this casual acquaintanceship turned into discussions around combining their efforts to make a new role-playing game. At first, this was nothing more than a fun pipe dream, but 2 or so years later, the concept began to take on concrete form, helped along by Kazuhiko Torishima, who was a senior contributor to Weekly Shonen Jump, and as a consequence knew both Akira Toriyama and Yuji Horii very well, and had become something of a pseudo-mentor to Sakaguchi. Upset that Enix wouldn't let Horii spread his wings and develop games outside of the Dragon Quest series, Torishima pushed Enix to let Horii and Toriyama work with Square and Sakaguchi, pitching them on the idea that the resulting project would have the potential to be a huge hit, and telling Sakaguchi and Square that he would field all complaints. Somehow, Torishima's plan succeeded, and the so-called Dream Team began to mull over what this new game would look like. To ensure there was no treading on toes, Horii took charge of the game's story, aided by scenario writer Masato Kato. Toriyama took care of character designs and general concept art, and Sakaguchi took care of production, something that made the most sense due to the way Enix operated, as Square were going to take on the bulk of the heavy lifting when it came to development. It meant that veteran Square employees were roped in to help out, with Kazuhiko Aoki, Akihiko Matsui, Yoshinori Kitase, and Takashi Togita all sharing directorial responsibilities. Tetsuya Takahashi and Tetsuya Nomura then oversaw in-game graphics, and all things considered, around 50 to 60 developers worked diligently to bring this new game to life throughout its development. This then made Chrono Trigger one of the most expensive Japanese-led games ever made at the time, having been in the works in some shape or form for almost 5 years, with 2 of those spent on proper production. Consumer expectations for what became known as Chrono Trigger were therefore very high, not least because it was there to perfectly fill the gap between the releases of Final Fantasy VI and Dragon Quest VI. In its first week on sale, Chrono Trigger managed to sell 700,000 physical copies in Japan, and while this was not as successful as the 1.15 million achieved by Final Fantasy VI, it still placed Chrono Trigger as the 3rd fastest selling game to ever launch on the Super Famicom. This strong performance was backed up by strong critical acclaim, with Famitsu awarding it a 34 out of 40. The praise was then echoed upon the game's launch in North America the following summer, as Chrono Trigger received top grades from Electronic Gaming Monthly, Game Informer, and GamePro, who all lauded its innovative gameplay and superb presentation. As a result, Chrono Trigger developed the reputation of being one of the best games released during the 16-bit era, and for many, it set a new benchmark for what the entire genre was capable of. By the end of its run, Chrono Trigger ended up selling over 2 million copies in Japan, which made it the 12th best-selling game released on that system in that region. And while its North American release was nowhere near as impactful, with only 300,000 copies being sold in that region across the Super Nintendo and the PlayStation by the time Square and Enix had merged. This success led to Square releasing a short text-based visual novel follow-up in Japan titled Radical Dreamers that was exclusive to the Super Famicom's Satellaview peripheral. Written by Kato, Radical Dreamers centered on the adventures of a group of thieves known as the Radical Dreamers, as they sought a mythical artifact known as the Frozen Flame. Radical Dreamers was intended as a sequel to Chrono Trigger, featuring some explicit connections to the game, but it was considerably darker in tone than Chrono Trigger had been. But it was merely a precursor to what was planned next, as after Square had established themselves as a powerhouse on the PlayStation, they decided to bring the franchise back with a proper follow-up. The year after Chrono Trigger had released, there was a huge ripple in the Japanese video games industry. After the release of the original Final Fantasy, Square had almost exclusively released all of their games on Nintendo systems, and Enix had treated Dragon Quest much the same. But after numerous disagreements throughout the 16-bit era in relation to Nintendo's CD-ROM ambitions, Square opted to defect to the PlayStation, and a very public fallout ensued, especially since Enix then followed suit soon after. With the PlayStation, Square were able to make the next entry in the Final Fantasy series even bigger than anyone had ever imagined. And when Final Fantasy VII released in January of 1997, the game was a smash hit, both with critics and fans, and commercially, selling millions of copies worldwide and setting a new benchmark for the role-playing genre. To keep their advantage, work began on Final Fantasy VIII with much haste, but Square was also keen to expand their reach. So alongside the development of big-budget titles like Saga Frontier, they explored the creation of Final Fantasy spin-offs and experimented with unfamiliar genres such as fighting games and shoot-'em-ups. Sakaguchi also gave the green light for some of his more senior team members to branch out, one of whom was Tetsuya Takahashi. After work on Final Fantasy VI had wrapped, Takahashi worked on the initial prototyping of Final Fantasy VII before that project was disrupted by Chrono Trigger. When they returned to work on Final Fantasy VII, he even submitted a draft proposal for the story that had been produced alongside his wife, Kaori Tanaka. The draft was unfortunately rejected, with it deemed too dark for a game featuring the Final Fantasy name. And this rejection led Takahashi to question whether he was on the right career path at Square. He continued to work on Final Fantasy VII as one of the graphic directors, but his output was not always in line with the agreed premise, and it became clear to Sakaguchi that Takahashi's head was not in the right place. So he gave him permission to branch out and work on a new IP, but only if he first oversaw a sequel to Chrono Trigger, something that made sense as it was a compromise and Takahashi was involved with the original game. This was seen as an incredible honour by some within the company, but it was not what Takahashi wanted to do. So the same scenario occurred again. Production started on the Chrono Trigger sequel, but Takahashi's team were ordered to create things that were more in line with the game he wanted to make. In the end, Sakaguchi caved again, and work on the Chrono Trigger sequel was shelved in favour of creating an ambitious sci-fi title called Xenogears that featured a deep and philosophical narrative and mechs. There was hope within the team that Xenogears would be a breath of fresh air for consumers, but development took longer than it should have, and Takahashi was forced to make compromises relating to release date and budget. The team had also been set the lofty goal of shipping 1 million physical copies in Japan, and upon launch, even though Xenogears managed to sell 500,000 copies in its first week, by the end of its run, only 916,891 copies had been sold. This was an incredible achievement, but the higher-ups at Square were unwilling to compromise on their targets, so Takahashi's team was disbanded, and the Xenogears IP was abandoned. Many of his team chose to leave Square, with Takahashi himself going on to found Monolith Soft. But those who opted to stay at Square were then assigned to one of two projects: Threads of Fate, or Chrono Cross, the sequel to Chrono Trigger they were meant to have worked on in the first place. One of those that chose to stay was Kato. After his work on Chrono Trigger and Radical Dreamers, Kato had contributed to Final Fantasy VII and then Xenogears. But parallel to working on Xenogears, he had been busy brainstorming a sequel, as he had not been completely satisfied with how Radical Dreamers had turned out. So once the idea for a Chrono sequel began to rematerialise at Square, Kato was given the responsibility of directing, and Hiromichi Tanaka was positioned as producer. The team assigned to work on Chrono Cross knew they had big shoes to fill, especially considering that this time around, the so-called Dream Team of Hori, Sakaguchi and Toriyama were not really going to be involved like they were with the first game. But it also meant that Kato's team were free to take things in a new direction, which he was personally excited for, as he did not want this new game to simply be rehashing Chrono Trigger's time-travelling adventure, but with a fresh coat of paint. Instead, Kato wanted to explore some of the ideas he had developed while working on Radical Dreamers, which would connect the game to Chrono Trigger narratively while making something completely new at the same time. This design ethos permeated every aspect of development, and the resulting game, Chrono Cross, began to resemble a very different game from its predecessor. Featuring a completely new battle system, 45 potential playable party members, and a story centered around parallel worlds instead of time travel, Chrono Cross was a huge departure from the gameplay and aesthetic of its predecessor. But knowing that more than just narrative connection was needed to help tie the games together, Kato personally sought out Yasuhiro Mitsuda to provide the game's soundtrack, as he believed Mitsuda's signature Chrono sound was essential to the project's identity. At the same time that Chrono Cross was in development, Square were also in the process of re-releasing earlier Final Fantasy games for the PlayStation. And to help build up some hype, they included Chrono Trigger in their Final Fantasy Chronicles release alongside Final Fantasy IV. The idea was that by re-releasing Chrono Trigger, players would have the chance to either reacquaint themselves with the story or get invested in the series for the first time. And it also provided the opportunity to add a bit of extra content to better link the games together, which they hoped would translate into higher sales for Chrono Cross. Thought was even had by Square to include Radical Dreamers as well, as it had only had a limited release. But this idea was downplayed by Kato himself, as the story, though an inspiration for Cross, wasn't canon to the game's narrative. Plus, Kato also didn't consider it his strongest work. Ultimately, even though Kato went along with Square's efforts to prime their core audience for the game, he wanted Chrono Cross to stand on its own and offer a full experience that didn't need the player to have played Chrono Trigger to make sense, but rather was enhanced by it. Chrono Cross was released in Japan on the 18th of November 1999, and its sales were significantly lower than what Chrono Trigger had achieved on the Super Famicom. But this was nothing compared to how the game stacked up against the first week sales of some of Square's other PlayStation games, with Final Fantasy VII selling over 2 million copies in its first week, Final Fantasy VIII selling 2.5 million copies, and even Xenogears, a brand new IP, selling over 500,000 the year prior. Despite these numbers, critical reception for the game was positive, and Chrono Cross even received a higher score from Famitsu than Chrono Trigger. When the game was released in North America, it found even more acclaim, with Electronic Gaming Monthly giving it a near-perfect score, declaring it a masterpiece, a sentiment echoed by GameSpot, who gave Chrono Cross a 10 out of 10, and IGN, who gave it a 9.7. Its sales in North America were also significantly better than what Chrono Trigger had achieved. But no amount of positive critical reception could offset the fact that financially, the game did not perform anywhere near what had been expected. And this frustrated management, who were desperate to find something non-Final Fantasy that could help share the load. Sadly, the reliance on the legacy of Chrono Trigger proved to be a bit of a double-edged sword, as some had been expecting Chrono Cross to be more of a direct continuation of the first game, and were turned off by its very different direction. And so, in line with their policy, following the release of Chrono Cross, the IP was put on hold and the team was disbanded, with most of its staff, including Kato, joining other projects like Parasite Eve 2, Brave Fencing Musashi, and the Mana series, or assigned to work on Sakaguchi's New Imperative, Final Fantasy's first foray into the realm of online gaming with Final Fantasy XI. After Chrono Cross's release, largely unaware of Square's disappointment with the game's performance, many fans were curious to see where the franchise would go next. And considering the legacy of Chrono Trigger, they awaited any news of further entries in the series. This was then intensified when it came to light that Square had registered a trademark for the title Chrono Break in 2001. But with no formal announcement made, fans were just left to speculate. Following the merger between Square and Enix in 2003, things only got more confusing, as interviews with key Chrono series staff members who were still at the company seemed to hint at internal desire to continue the franchise. For example, when Richard Honeywood, who was an established localization director, spoke to IGN in 2013 about Final Fantasy XI, he mentioned that while they would love to work on a new Chrono game, the project would be too large to handle, considering most of the staff now worked on Final Fantasy XI. Tokita also gave an interview in the same year, and he alluded to a new Chrono game being more plausible now that Square and Enix had merged, but he made sure to keep things theoretical, saying there was a big difference between management wanting something to happen and the developers themselves wanting something to happen. But these comments were then offset by others that hinted at the unlikeliness of such a project ever seeing the light of day. For example, in 2005, Yuji Horii mentioned to 1UP in an interview that since he believed he could accomplish all his creative goals within the Dragon Quest franchise, he had no personal aspirations to ever work on the Chrono series again. And then in 2007, Tanaka was interviewed by French publication Jeux France about Final Fantasy III on the DS. And he said that because the teams that created Trigger and Cross were made of different creative talents, it would be hard to make a new game with the same feel, and thus no further sequels were planned at that time. Much to everyone's surprise though, the year later, Square Enix announced they'll be re-releasing Chrono Trigger for the Nintendo DS, and that Kato and Mitsuda were involved with the project, and that this new game will be based on the original release with enhancements brought over from the updated PlayStation port, but with some new content. The response at launch was positive, as first week sales were over double that for the PlayStation 1 re-release, and the revival seemed to suggest to fans that perhaps things were turning around. Sadly though, that was not to be the case. In 2009, when Square Enix Vice President Shinji Hashimoto spoke to RPG Site, he told them that the company had been unimpressed by the series sales of the Chrono franchise, and that the company believed that despite the reputation of the two games as fan favourites, both games had had their chance to go big and had not delivered, whereas some of Square Enix's other franchises had not yet been given the chance, hence their decision to focus on them instead, like Front Mission. Following this, now nearly a decade out from the original trademark filing of Chrono Break, no real news ever came to pass, despite the question about a sequel being asked every now and again whenever someone had the chance to speak to someone directly involved with the franchise. It seemed to many that Chrono Break was just vaporware, but was there any real smoke behind the fire? Well, the short answer is yes. Square Enix continued to release ports of Chrono titles, such as the digital-only PlayStation Classic versions of Chrono Trigger and Cross on the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation Portable. There was also a mobile version of Trigger in 2011 and a Steam version in 2018. Sadly, while none of these releases were any real indications of a forthcoming sequel, time revealed that following the release of Chrono Cross, there actually were attempts to create a new entry in the series. As it turns out, behind the scenes there was interest from Sakaguchi to develop a sequel to Chrono Trigger that would have been a different take than the one explored by Chrono Cross. But he couldn't get Square's management at the time to see eye to eye on it, and the project never got off the ground. In addition, Kato had also started planning for what his next take on the series would have been after Chrono Cross. This plan, seemingly worked on by Kato alongside Takashi Tokita, was going to be the game that the trademark Chrono Break was registered for back in 2001. But the game never got beyond pre-production, as the project was cancelled before anything concrete was accomplished. Kato then left Square Enix not long after. The reason for the cancellation of Break is unknown, but it seems likely that this was due in large to Chrono Cross simply not meeting Square's expectations. And that, around the turn of the millennium, Square also had their hands full with other financial commitments, such as the animated movie Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. Following the abandoning of the US Chrono Break trademark in 2003, a Japanese trademark was retained until 2012. But there's no hard evidence to suggest that any new games in the Chrono series were ever officially being considered. That's not to say the concepts weren't used elsewhere though. In an interview with IGN in 2018, Tokita was asked specifically about Chrono Break, and responded that though the game was ultimately cancelled, the overall idea was reused for Final Fantasy Dimensions 2's plot, specifically highlighting AMO's character setting and the balance between the three characters at the beginning of the game. In recent years, the Chrono Mill has started up again thanks to a renewed interest from Square Enix in the series. In 2022, they released a remastered version of Chrono Cross titled the Radical Dreamers Edition that also featured the Radical Dreamers Satellaview game. It was a clear attempt to gauge interest, but the port itself wasn't of very high quality and its sales ended up being lackluster. The following year, Horii, Sakaguchi and Torishima all got together to discuss the franchise's legacy. Unfortunately for fans though, what they had to say was mostly a retread of the same old sentiments. Specifically, the three shared that they thought it was unlikely another sequel would ever be planned, for a variety of reasons, and that if they were given the chance to work together on another game, they would want to try their hand at something new altogether, as opposed to diving back into the Chrono series. This seemingly once again buried all hope of a new Chrono game, whether it be a sequel to Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, Break, or otherwise. But rumours will always continue. Over the years, there have also been some scattered fan attempts to make a new Chrono game, but none of these have gotten very far, perhaps due to Square Enix's penchant for cease and desist orders around the IP, as was seen with the fan 3D remaster of Chrono Trigger called Chrono Resurrection. Ultimately, though there have been some basic efforts to try and bring the Chrono series back, up to and including pre-production on ideas on where to take the narrative, in the end there wasn't really anything of substance behind Chrono Break, and it just didn't get off the ground. That was, in large part, due to internal Square and then Square Enix politics, in addition to the fact that many of the series' key members had left the company. As these people were so key to what made the Chrono series, getting everyone involved again and on the same page as Square Enix just seems unlikely at this point. But that's not to say that support for the legacy of the franchise is currently zero, as Square Enix has clearly made an effort to try and keep existing entries accessible to those who want to play them. These releases have done their job of keeping the series in the wider gaming zeitgeist, so even if the chances of Chrono Break or any other new entry currently seem less likely than ever before, the series continues to live on in the hearts of fans everywhere. And perhaps, given Square's recent efforts with revitalising the original Dragon Quest trilogy in HD 2D, we'll at least get to see a remake of Chrono Trigger someday in a similar style, something that even Yuji Horii has jokingly hinted at as recently as December of last year when asked about the game's 30th anniversary. But with that, thank you so much for watching everyone. My name is Darryl, and together with Colin and Chris, we hope you enjoyed listening to the curious case of Chrono Break. If you did, then please consider giving this video a like and commenting below as to whether or not you think we'll ever see a continuation of the Chrono franchise. I'd also like to give a massive thanks to everyone who supports us on Patreon, as they allow us to create videos like this one. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more RPG goodness.